Now, as you begin to work with other people's code, you may run into a situation where they're using an array type structure for a variable, but it's a different type of variable called an object. This happens in Drupal a lot. So even though many of the same array functions will apply to an object, the way we reference and create an object is going to be different than how we create and reference an array. So in this video, what we're going to do is look at how to use an object as an array. Let's go ahead and jump to the resource pack directory, and let's open up the 12th step in the strings and variables folder called using objects like arrays. Go ahead and copy the code and paste it over the code that's in your test.php file and save it. Now in PHP, when you hear the word object, it has a number of connotations to it. For example, you may have heard of something called object-oriented programming. That involves a particular structure of code that we'll explore much later on in this series. And objects in object-oriented programming tend to be a bit more complex than the ones that we're talking about now, even though the structure is very similar. The objects that we're using now are basically an alternative syntax for arrays. They're a little bit more clumsy to create, but many people prefer the object structure when referencing arrays, which is why when you use Drupal, there's so many arrays that use the object structure. For example, the user variable or the node variable. So what we're doing in this file is looking at how to create an object that's the equivalent to an associative array, and then we look at how to create an object that's the equivalent to a multi-dimensional array. Our first step is to create the object. And we do that by assigning a variable the result of new std class. Now what this will do is simply create an empty object. It's as if we're doing myObject equals array, and then we're using empty parentheses in order to create an empty array. The next step is to add items to this object, and we do so by using this dash right bracket syntax. This dash right bracket syntax is the equivalent of the square brackets that you see wrapped around an index in an associative array. So for example, in my object, what we're saying is that we're going to assign the index George the value of 1972. For the index of Sally, we're going to assign 1975, and so on. So again, the structure is very similar to an array. The only difference here is the syntax that we're using. When we want to reference an item inside of this object, we simply use this dash right caret in the index in order to grab the value. So go ahead and make sure that this file is saved and jump to the browser and go to test.php and refresh. And what we'll see here is the value of our object where the key is George. So that's going to be 1972. If we look at our code, right here is our key George, and the value is 1972. So there's nothing really new here except the syntax that we use in order to assign values to the object and reference them. The way we create a multi-dimensional object is very similar to how we'd create a multi-dimensional array. What we're going to do is assign an object as the value of an item within another object. Now with arrays, we can use a syntax that's a little bit easier to read and use. There's less duplication, but objects are not as easy to create. So what we're doing here is creating an object called myObject, and we're assigning it 3 items just like we did with our array example. The first has a key of George, and we're creating it as an empty object. And then we're going through each of the keys, birth year, fave band, and shoe size, and assigning values to it. Note that we are referencing an index within an index here. So in an array, what we'd have is a set of square brackets right next to another set of square brackets. In the case of an object, we just have the dash right bracket to indicate the index. Each of these other items, the Sally index and the Deepak index, follow the same structure. So if we wanted to reference one of these objects within the object, let's go ahead and uncomment out this example here. We'd use a dash right bracket and indicate our first index, which is going to be Sally here. And then we'd indicate with another dash right bracket the index within that object, so fave band. So we should expect this to say Coldplay. Let's go ahead and save this and jump back to the browser and refresh. And sure enough, we see Coldplay displayed in the browser.